Good morning and hello, everyone. I'm Evelyn Diaz, president of Heartland Alliance. And on behalf of Heartland Alliance, I want to welcome you and thank you for joining us this morning. For those of you who are getting to know us, Heartland Alliance is a 134-year-old organization dedicated to advancing social, economic, and racial justice to those who've been denied it. We do this by providing comprehensive services like housing, healthcare, jobs, and justice services, and advocating for policy change, increased funding, and systems change. And every year, we come together to share information about critical issues, shine a light on some of the lives and experiences that can get buried in the statistics, and help our audience see their power to make a difference. It's hard to believe that this is our fourth Standing Together event. I'm thrilled to have such great virtual participation today. Last year, we focused our discussion on the impact of the more than 1,000 permanent punishments just in the state of Illinois that keep people with a criminal record from being able to access jobs, housing, education, the things they need to move forward in life. More specifically, we discussed the barriers for women who've been involved in the criminal legal system. It was a powerful conversation featuring experts and including those with lived experiences. This year, we are incredibly fortunate to have assembled another all-star panel of extraordinary female leaders, and I can't wait for you to hear from them. But before I go any further, I want to thank our event sponsor, Exelon. We very much appreciate Exelon's support of this important and timely conversation. And finally, I want to encourage all of you to take part in this conversation this morning. Please feel free to tag us on social media and share whatever interesting ideas you hear this morning using hashtag Standing Together. Now, let me turn to today's discussion. Over the past 18 months, we have seen the disproportionate toll of COVID-19 on health, social, and economic outcomes within Black and Latinx communities. This year, Heartland Alliance's signature report called The COVID-19 Domino Effect illuminates in both stories and numbers how the pandemic created cascading hardships for Black and Latinx Illinoisans, with particular attention on health and wealth gaps, and the ways these issues got compounded for women of color, and especially young women of color. For example, young Black and brown women ages 18 to 24 fared significantly worse, like 20 percentage points worse than the state average in lost income from employment, reports of depression and anxiety, and ability to pay for household expenses. Blacks and Latinos generally disproportionately had greater housing instability. They had to use credit and spend their savings. And through it all, Latinos, particularly the undocumented, had virtually no safety net. lacking health insurance at twice the rate of the state average, and taking up food benefits and unemployment at very low rates relative to their actual need. And that was mostly due to being legally prohibited from accessing these vital benefits. So the impressive women joining us this morning are dedicated to addressing these issues, driving change to narrow the wealth gap and increase access to mental health care, lifting their voices to change policies and practices, and creating a more just society. This morning, as you listen to the conversation, we want you to be inspired to act and engage. Think about how you can stand together with us to bring equity and opportunity even to the most marginalized among us. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists. Dr. Helene Gayle is President and CEO of the Chicago Community Trust. Under her leadership, the Trust has adopted a new strategic focus on closing the racial and ethnic wealth gap in the Chicago region. Dr. Gayle is an expert on global developments and humanitarian and health issues, given her former roles at both CARE International and the Centers for Disease Control. She was recently awarded the Chicago Mayor's Medal of Honor for her work on COVID relief and recovery, and has been recognized on both Forbes and Nonprofit Times Power lists. Ms. Kedra Newsom-Reeves is a partner and managing director at BCG in Chicago. She has multiple engagements in the public and social sectors, including catalytic community investment approaches for foundations and private investors, and recommendations on anti-violence efforts across public and social sectors. She is an outspoken advocate of closing the racial wealth gap. And finally, Dr. Brandy Jackson, who is Chief Behavioral Health Officer at Howard Brown Health and an adjunct professor of psychiatry at Rush University Medical Center. She's a board-certified psychiatrist. Her clinical and research interests include health equity and social justice, cultural psychiatry, and psychotic disorders. And Heartland Alliance was extremely fortunate to have Dr. Jackson on our staff at our Inglewood Health Clinic when COVID-19 shut down the country and everything was essentially running amok. So Dr. Jackson, I want to start with you, actually. And as we think about this domino effect, you were on the front lines. You were there when the first dominoes, so to speak, started to fall in the Black community. At the very outset, it was all about protecting people's health in those early days, and then followed very quickly by food insecurity and job loss and growing mental, emotional, psychological effects. So I know a lot of us in the audience, and certainly all of us here on the panel, we saw the toll of the pandemic on our employees and our families' mental health. So as a psychiatrist serving vulnerable populations, tell us what you saw over the past year, particularly in terms of the type and number and intensity of the mental health needs in Black and Brown communities.
Well, thank you for that question, Evelyn. And first of all, thank you so much for having me, and hello to my fellow panelists. I'm so excited to be here. I have to take a breath. Going back to that time, and it's just maybe a year and a half ago, I think back to March of 2020, to the growing realization of how big this thing really is and was. As you said, I was at Heartland Alliance Health. I was practicing on the South Side in Inglewood. And if you had asked me before that moment to tell you about the state of mental health care in our country and our city, I would have told you we were in crisis. And when COVID-19 hit, it was like taking the floor, that crisis floor, and just pulling even that out from under us. I'll never be able to find the words, but I think what I can do to paint the picture is talk a little bit about my patients and what they told me. And I have these flashbulb memories of folks who have been experiencing homelessness, chronic mental illness for a long time, really wonderful, hardworking people who literally said to me, am I going to survive this? A lot of confusion, a lot of folks who already had the kind of cards stacked against them getting that last hit. And I think when it comes to mental health, it's one thing to have known chronic mental illness. So I saw certainly a worsening of the mental health of folks who had already struggled, but I also saw a new wave of people who had never seen and sought mental health care before, people who were breadwinners of their families who had lost their job, people who were watching their children be very fearful at school. And it put a new stress on the system that didn't exist before. So I think it was both. It was a combination of people who are already vulnerable getting yet another hit when I thought it was impossible. And then people who had kind of been floating along in the middle class even, and just really got that last hit that brought them to their knees.
Did you notice any kind of shift too in the nature or intensity, and what and what can you just say about people's ability to access services at that time?
It was, I'm privileged, very privileged to have been working at Heartland Alliance Health at that time. So philosophically, as an organization, we've been, we understand that there's people who live below the poverty line who need a social net that works. We were in that space. So in many ways, I think I was in a place that was the most well-equipped to really handle this challenge. And even with all that will and all that experience, it was really tough to meet the need. We, by far, the need outstripped our capacity. It outstripped the capacity of us plus all of our partners and new partners. It's indescribable, the need. It can't be overstated, the need that came through for mental health care at all levels.
And that's really important, because I think it's hard. I think it's really easy, rather, for people to forget what it was like right at the beginning. And then that has kind of pulled through. Are you noticing that 18 months later, the intensity or kind of the need demand for services has changed?
Thank you for this question. I love this question because I want to caution the world really into this sort of feeling like, okay, the worst part of the biological COVID-19 attack is over, and therefore people are getting better. When we think about trauma and being traumatized, it's important to know that it's hard for the human brain to even wrap its head around what occurred while the trauma is still happening. So in many ways, we're at our most vulnerable place. There's been thankfully signs of recovery at all fronts. And I think a lot of people, though, are looking back and realizing that the life they left is still not back and will never come back. So the pain of that. And really, there's a disaster mode that the mind can go into where you just survive for your kids, for your loved ones, for your family, for your community. And as things actually start to recover, we have that time, that pause to reflect on all that we have lost. And so I'm seeing that the need is still rising for mental health care. And I believe it's going to continue to rise.
Great. That is a perfect place for us to shift gears a little bit. I'm going to come back to you, and I want to talk about solutions. But before we do that, I'd like to go now to Kedra. Kedra, you are an outspoken advocate of reducing the wealth gap between Black and white Americans, particularly by transforming institutions. And just to set the stage, in what ways do you believe institutions, for example, government, banking, have contributed to the wealth gap?
So first, Evelyn, thank you so much. I really echo Brandy's sentiments. It's so wonderful to be with this group and having this conversation. Just to tie back to something that Brandy said, I want to talk a little bit about what wealth is, because I think we often hear this word, we hear net worth, and we don't really think about it. But just to tie it back to Brandy's points around how COVID has affected communities from a mental health perspective, it also has really affected wealth as well. I think 25% of COVID deaths have affected a child, either a parent or a grandparent, and that has real implications for the wealth gap. And so I just want to kind of dimensionalize that first, and then talk a little bit to your point around governments and institutions and how they play a role. I think when we think about the wealth gap, it's really important that we refer to it, I think, from our perspective as a wealth loop, right? It is all of your accumulation of assets and all the accumulation of your liabilities over time. Your net worth is just at a point in time, how much do you have? But really, your wealth over the course of your life is about that accumulation of assets and liabilities, including intergenerational wealth that is passed down. When we talk about intergenerational wealth, we're not talking about a company or a trust fund. We're talking about those small things. Help with college payments, even as a child, the activities you're able to participate in. Those are all, in a way, transfers of wealth from one generation to another. So I think it's always really important to talk about it in that way, that it really is a loop, and it really is about the intergenerational accumulation of wealth over time. Because I think when we talk about the wealth gap being 10x, it's very hard to wrap your head around that. But when you think about it over the course of generations, it can start to dimensionalize that. And what's really important about that intergenerational wealth is that if you think about each generation, one of the things that really drives such a vast wealth gap is that the growth in wealth from one generation to another has been small. So the growth for my grandparents or my great-grandparents during their lifetime was so flat that there wasn't really an opportunity to pass on wealth and continue to build and grow on that over time. And so I say that just to ground us in what we're really speaking about. It is about that accumulation, and every choice you've made: education, income, home ownership, business ownership, investments in the market that will then allow a faster growth of wealth, and then that estate planning that allows you to hold on to wealth and pass it down. It is all of those pieces. And so when we really think about ways in which governments or institutions have played a role in perpetuating the wealth gap, I'll just give kind of three brief examples that I think are quite salient. And first, I'll just go to the end of slavery. At the end of slavery, you always hear about 40 acres and a mule. This is really an opportunity for our country to provide some assets that were owned to formerly enslaved families to build their lives upon. And when that decision was reversed and settlements were given to former slave owners, that is one big step that could have gone up, that went down in terms of how the wealth gap started to grow for Black and brown families versus white families or former slave owners. So that's one very salient example. But you think about the compounding of just the 40 acres and a mule over generations. Where would that be today versus where we are now? I think another really helpful example is the GI Bill. And I talk about these examples because these are opportunities for step changes in wealth generation for families. The GI Bill, soldiers come back from the war. The GI Bill is created to provide low interest student loans and mortgages to families. But the GI Bill set standards and policies for banks, but those were really left to the state level. So each state could decide how that would work. During the time of the GI Bill, 9 million veterans received close to $4 billion in aid. However, Black veterans largely didn't benefit. They received less than 2% of that value from a mortgage perspective. Now, we know there are many Black veterans that served in the war. They did not benefit from that bill. And again, that would have been, a chance to step up. I talked to a colleague whose grandfather was in the war, and he says, actually, the home that his grandfather was able to purchase with the GI Bill funded his parents' college education, which then in turn funded his education and his path forward. So you really think about, again, an opportunity to make a step change. The last example I think is really a good one that's very recent and I think salient to all of us as we experience this crisis is the housing crisis. So certainly a boom in home ownership for a good period of time for Black and brown homeowners. But during the crisis, as people lost their jobs, were not able to pay their mortgages, home values went down, so many families, thousands of families lost their homes. So again, an opportunity where if legislation and banking policy had been put into place that allowed people to hold on to those assets, we'd be in a very different place. And now, as we think about home ownership today, which drives we think about 15 to 20% of the wealth gap, that those families now don't have the home ownership rates of white families. Home ownership rates for Black and brown families are about 50%, and for white families is about 75%. So again, really big steps and opportunities to make step changes in the wealth gap that were not reaped and not taken advantage of at the time.
Right. And so those big step changes, and then there are just smaller things that help families be resilient, like their savings account or having to then take out credit. That was also part of the experience as well. Super illuminating. I'm going to come back to you as well, because I want to talk about what the big solutions are. But let's bridge now to Dr. Gale. Dr. Gale, I love that you decided to join us, because I've said this to you before. If this panel were a Venn diagram, you would be right in that exciting part where the two issues that we just heard about intersect. You are public health experts, so you know very well the health disparities and the system dynamics that Dr. Jackson was talking about. You run the Chicago Community Trust, which supports communities that have been devastated by the pandemic across every dimension of life. And under your leadership at the Trust, you've made this big bet on eliminating the wealth gap. So taking into account all of your perspectives, what does an equitable COVID-19 recovery look like? And what's the right place for us to start?
Well, thanks for that. And again, as my other panelists, thanks so much for including me on this. It's wonderful to be able to talk to your audience and be a part of this. And as you said, I've kind of gone from my background in public health to now thinking a lot more about the economic underpinnings. And so when COVID hit, a pandemic that caused a economic crisis, it really was kind of in that that nexus of those two issues. And we felt it was important to first of all work on taking care of people's immediate needs, and both the panels have talked about these issues of just the fact that we know that there were people who were going without food, who didn't have money to pay their bills, who were lost jobs, living in homes that put them at greater risk, et cetera, and other conditions, while many of us had the luxury of being able to work from home and social distance and all these other things. And so we know that the communities that were already economically fragile, already had health disproportionate poor health, were impacted the most by this pandemic. So we felt it was important that we took care of some of these immediate needs, mounted a major effort, the COVID Relief Fund, that was able to raise $35 million, get support out to families that were most hard hit. But then, not very far into it, it was very clear that this economic crisis was a deep crisis, and again, was born on the backs of communities and households who were already economically fragile going into this. And we said that we did not want this to be like the recession of 2008, 2009, where Black and brown communities have still not, by and large, recovered from that recession. So once again, we looked at, were there ways that we could have an effort that really addressed this? We put together resources, partners across the philanthropic, the business, and government space to develop the initiative We Rise Together. And We Rise Together is an initiative to really focus on, can we in the Chicago region have a recovery that has a lens of equity? And can we make sure that we are doing what is necessary to bring those communities that were economically fragile to a higher point than they were before the pandemic? And so that's really what we're focused on, along with our long-term commitment to closing the racial and ethnic wealth gap. How can we, in this immediate aftermath of the COVID pandemic, really look at recovery with a lens towards equity.
That's absolutely wonderful. And I know you have some ideas about how we can do that. I'm going to come back to you on all of that. But let me reference, Kedra, in one of the articles that you've written on the wealth gap. You wrote that governments should not only provide safety nets for citizens, but also create trampolines that help them advance. And I really love that visual for the next set of questions. So everybody think about trampolines and maybe asking you about trampolines. So Kedra, let's just start with you. The pandemic, as we've been talking about, has set Black and brown communities even further back, or let's just say deeper in a hole. And we're going to need trampolines. Can you share more about the kinds of government solutions that you think would serve as trampolines?
Thanks, Evelyn. I think, so first I say this is governments, but also the private sector. This is a cross-sector discussion we have to be having, and governments can certainly regulate some of the things we'll talk about when we talk about the private sector. But the way that we really define trampolines are, it's kind of simple in a way, but conditions that give people equal access to opportunities and empower them to thrive economically. And I think there's a question around, well, what does that empowerment really mean? And what does equal access to opportunity mean? On the opportunity side, some of it is very basic. It is high quality education, healthcare, mental health support, employment to enable folks to earn an income. But it is also about giving them opportunities that help them advance beyond that, whether that be training programs to change careers or into new industries, or we talked earlier about banking and credit. We think credit is a really important vehicle. Fair credit is an important vehicle for a business to start. If you think about women, childcare is a really important vehicle, again, to pursue a career or to start a business. So part of this is not about safety nets. I think sometimes we define things that I might have mentioned just now as being safety nets. Those are not safety nets. Those are the things people need to rebound out of a crisis and move on to their next phase of life. But without those supports from a trampoline perspective, if you will, it's very difficult to make that transition. And we talked earlier about women being so affected by the crisis that we are, I'd say, still in. And when we think about things like childcare, I think you think about the mental health challenges that women have had, the challenges around employment, the challenges around seeing your support system, your village, if you will, start to kind of collapse around you as family members may have passed away, et cetera. What is the trampoline that helps that individual woman recover from this crisis? It is the things that she needs to start to pursue her dreams and her passions, which often mean supporting her family, access to quality food, quality education, and financial services that allow her to thrive as well. So that's really how we really think about that. And I think in a way, it's challenging to talk about because they seem like such basic things that we should all have access to. But because we don't, we have safety nets. And we think it's important to supply those needs.
Kendra, you said fair credit. You said those two words, and like a bell went off for me. Can you say more about fair credit?
Sure. When we talk about fair credit, we're talking about fair interest credit at mass, at scale for individuals, for families to support education, to support day-to-day needs, to span the gaps between when your check comes and when a bill is due. But we're also talking about fair credit to invest in education or start a business. And so this is really about providing financial, and I say credit, I want to expand the definition because I think when we talk about credit, we have to think about credit cards or mortgages. I'm talking about the small lending you need over time just to maintain the cash flow you need to live your life. And so if we start at those most basic needs, there are a lot of individuals that are not in the banking system in a way that gives them access to fair credit. We think about payday lending services or check cashing services, the interest being charged on those events is quite unfair. And we actually look at numbers of Black and brown individuals, much higher numbers of Black and brown families are either or underbanked, and so don't have access to the credit system. In Memphis, 60% of Black and brown families are or underbanked. So when we think about wealth, to your point earlier, Evelyn, wealth is the big decisions you make, but it is all of those small day-to-day decisions as well. And if we're not giving people access to fair banking systems, a fair credit, if you will, we are putting them at a disadvantage.
Thank you, Kedra. Your remarks actually reminded me that I got a note from a staff member not too long ago, thanking us for what we're doing inside of Heartland Alliance to support our staff. And she just happened to mention that she has lost 22 family members to COVID-19. And when I read that, I kind of didn't know what to do with it. I was overwhelmed by the level of loss and grief that represents. And so Brandy, my next question is for you. What is it going to take to bring health equity to Black and brown communities? What are the trampolines that you envision?
Thank you for the trampoline analogy that I've received. I'm receiving it. It is accurate. I'm going to use it with credit because I think it's so important, such an important concept. The answer to the question of how we close that health equity gap that everyone talks about, it's simple, and the answer is will. It's consistent will. It's will followed by action specifically, but we have to begin with the will. And when I look at us as a country, look at us as a city of Chicago, I think how many things we've overcome already, fires and disasters, and how in times of great strife, we've found a way to keep pushing. And this time is no different. We're no different than our forerunners who have decided to keep pushing when it seemed impossible. And for me, as someone who's part of that fight for racial equity, for health equity, for equity for the LGBTQ community, which is a large part of my work, I think I'm hopeful that we've reached a critical point in will at the highest levels. So I think it's always been the people who are doing the direct service. So me, again, as a sort of a psychiatrist seeing patients one-on-one, or the staff in the clinic who show up every day of the pandemic and try to understand how far 6 feet is and how to measure it. Those folks are driven by mission. And for those of us who are in, leadership, administrative leadership positions, I often think about our responsibility to meet them and match them in that commitment. All members of the team are important, certainly, but those of us who are privileged to have power to change policy and make decisions, we also have an equal responsibility to use that power. So I think the short answer is will with action. And what does that mean? I think it's overwhelming to think about all the actions that we could take. It depends on our position. It depends on our sphere of influence. But I think the important thing is to take an action and not make the mistake of thinking that action doesn't matter and isn't seen. My sister's a physician, family medicine physician here in Chicago, and we talk about this a lot. We say that if there was a person who was in the water drowning, like so many people are drowning right now, and you wanted to help that person desperately, well, the will to help that person wouldn't give them oxygen, and you wouldn't scream into the water, "What do you want me to do to help you?" You would, because if they could answer, they'd punch you, and they'd say, "I don't know, take a life jacket, a boat, drain the whole river. It doesn't matter. Help me." And I think we're in that place where we can get stuck in our goodwill, get stuck in the idea that we are helping by acknowledging the problem, and those things are necessary. But we must never forget that at every moment we have a choice to think, or to think and to do. And if you don't know what the next step is, taking, as Oprah says, the next right step is certainly something that we should value. We should do at every turn.
So maybe let me just follow up on a couple of things that both Brandy as well as Kedra mentioned. And you asked the question about how do we actually look at closing health disparities. And I think one thing that's so important to remember is that so much of what causes health disparities is outside of the health realm. We know that it is critically important that people have access to high quality health services, but 65% or more of what causes health disparities are what we call social determinants of health. It's whether or not you have a job that allows you to pay your bills and feed your family. It's whether you have access to nutritious food, whether you have safety, clean air to breathe, clean water to drink, access to high quality education. All of those things actually make more difference in your health outcome than whether or not you have access to health services. Never want to underestimate the importance of having health services when you need them. But, again, take COVID as a case in point. We know that people who had higher rates of COVID infection were often people who were at risk because of the jobs that they worked, the homes that they lived in, the inability to have safe practices, et cetera. And so we've learned a lot through COVID about these social determinants of health and how we have to think differently about what it takes to make sure that people have the things that they need to have a healthy life. I think also, again, following up on some of the things that Kedra mentioned, this notion of safety nets that we talk about, they're not safety nets. These are basic needs that human beings have to be able to live a safe and healthy life. We saw through COVID the ability for public policy to do things that we never thought would be possible. Give people money to pay their bills, extend credit for families who had children, look at other ways in which we made sure that people had their basic needs met, moratoriums on evictions. These are the kinds of things that we should be thinking about as we look at public policy long term and not wait for the next crisis, but to really think about what does it take so that everybody has the opportunity to realize their potential, have a healthy life, have a safe life, and be able to have economic equity.
Beautifully stated. I'm going to just ask all three of you to answer the next question the same way, or rather, it's the same question for all three of you. We've heard about some of the systemic problems exacerbated by the pandemic. We've talked about some systemic solutions. I know our audience and they want to know how they can help make a difference. So for all of you, what is one practical piece of advice, one practical thing that they can do to be part of the solution? And I urge you to be bold here. Is there something bold that we as professional women and men can do that would create a positive kind of cascading domino effect, but for the good? We'll start with you, Kedra.
Sure. I actually want to build on what Dr. Gale was just saying around policy, but turn to the private sector. We don't have to wait for policy, right? We don't have to wait for regulation. There are investments we can all be making. And I think as leaders in the private sector, thinking about how do you include equity in strategic decisions you're making, where you choose to locate that next building, how you choose to use your balance sheet to invest in communities that are surrounding you that can boost up the city that you live in yourself. Here in Chicago, I think what we're seeing with Invest Southwest is a great example of that. But there are many ways to participate in investing in the community. And I think to the point that Dr. Gale raised, that is part of the trampoline. Investing in neighborhoods who have not received investment. Think about the health benefits of that for our community. Think about the small business benefits for that for our community. That is a massive lever to really drive change in the recovery that we're in, but really long-term infusing that lens of equity into business strategy, we think is so critical. And we really encourage people to think about that. And that is not a pie in the sky idea or something that needs to wait for regulation. That is something we can each do right now as we make really big strategic decisions. And I just also add, as individuals, I'm a big proponent of estate planning. I think that we don't fully understand what that means. And a lot of the loss we're going to see coming out of COVID is these unexpected deaths and the inability to pass small and large assets on to the next generation. And so as individuals, we've got to think about that and the ways that we can talk to our communities and our families about estate planning and ensuring that we have that plan moving forward as a family and in the next generation, I think is really critical as well.
Dr. Brandy Jackson?
At the risk of being predictable, my request of everyone in the room is really to make a list of at least one thing that you have lost for yourself over the last year and a half. We've all lost something, grieved something. Challenge yourself to acknowledge that and write down one step you can make and intend to make to begin to heal that within yourself. I think right now is the time to tell the truth. We first have to tell the truth to ourselves, and then hopefully we find the courage to tell the truth to the people around us that we love, and eventually, and importantly, we then tell that truth to the world and to the people who have the decision-making power.
Thank you, Dr. Jackson. Dr. Helene Gale.
Yeah, I would say vote. I think that it is so critical, first of all, that people take time to educate themselves about what are some of the big issues that are going on, and that you think about who supports the issues that you think can make the biggest difference and get out there and vote. And I think we have to preserve our right to vote. I think we have to, but I think that means staying engaged, understanding the issues. But first and foremost, I think it's so critical that we all exercise our right to vote.
That's a perfect place for us to end on those very actionable, inspiring, and thought-provoking responses. As service providers, as funders and allies, even if you're just curious about how to make the biggest difference, you just heard some really thoughtful, poignant, and practical ways today. I would like to once again thank Dr. Helene Gale, Dr. Brandy Jackson, and Kedra Newsom-Reeves for sharing their time and experience with us today. It has been an absolute pleasure to bring your voice and your experience to drive the conversation toward action. And I want to thank all of our viewers for caring about the issues that affect marginalized women and women of color, and for staying in the conversation to learn more about what's happening behind the numbers with women in our city and our nation. I want to encourage you to be and stay impatient with the status quo, and to recognize that we all benefit when every person achieves equity and opportunity. Finally, I encourage each of you to embrace your unique power and harness it to help make big, bold, and lasting change. And it's a lot less scary to do and a lot more powerful when we do it standing together. Thank you for joining us.